topic is focused on the role of women in philanthropy, and particularly their expanding power. And what you're about to see is actually that they are going to be a force that is dwarfing men over the next 10 years. And one stat you'll see is that by 2030, they should control 2/3 of all of the wealth in the United States. So we'll dig in more there, but if you only take away one thing today, it's that world is shifting pretty quickly. And if our strategies aren't built with women first in mind, we're going to have some trouble. Two notes I want to make before we get started here. The one is, it's always challenging to do these sessions on women in philanthropy or millennials in philanthropy or baby boomers or whatever, because obviously no group is monolithic, right? But we do have some broader trends in the data, and that's what we're going to pull from. So I just want to note that. One other note is that, a lot of folks, a lot of the data that we'll look at is sort of the difference between men and women and how they give. And some people always ask about, well, do you have any data for how trans folks are giving or how folks that are non-binary are giving? And the answer is there's just a lot less data available. So I'm just going to name that up front, that you're not going to see a lot of research on folks that are not identifying as male or female, and there's just not a lot out there yet. So when that comes up, we'll obviously bring it to you. The other note that's important to know here as we get started is my apartment building is conducting fire alarm tests all week, and it's intermittently going. Now, it's not screeching sirens, it is smooth jazz. So if you suddenly hear smooth jazz at minute 17 or whatever, that's what's going on. So just letting you know in case that happens. It's decent, it's not the best jazz, but it's decent. And you might hear it at some point. All right, let's dive in. So quickly, some housekeeping. This event, like many of these, is CFRE approved for 1.0 credits. We've added a question to the survey to certify your participation. And it's possible that you get audited. So at the end of the session, we will drop in a link to the survey. You fill that out, and that's how you'll be able to get CFRE credits. Here's the agenda for today. The most important note is at the bottom, which is that recording and slides will be sent around later today. So I saw that someone just asked this, and yeah, we'll get rolling. Welcome to the folks who are just joining us. Amy from ADL in New York City, Jane from Kansas City, who seems to share a last name with me, which is nice. Bunch of other folks as well. So glad to have you all here. All right, so very quick introduction. So my name is Patrick. I've met a lot of you in person. I've met a lot of you virtually. Very lucky to be the co-founder of FreeWill alongside my wonderful friend, Jenny Shia Spradling. And we are really lucky to work alongside a wonderful team, closing on an $8 billion raised, recently passed 1,200 nonprofits, including many of you. So if you are one of our partners, thank you. We love learning together. We love working with you. We love helping you raise a ton of money. So just a big shout out of gratitude from everybody here. And one other thing on the note of gratitude, one of the things we like to do here is give away some of our favorite books as just a really big thank you to you for coming to spend an hour with us. And so today's book is Dare to Lead by Brene Brown. We'll send it to 20 people. Same thing as the CFRE, we'll drop a survey in at the end of the chat. And so if you're interested, let us know, and we sort of select 20 people to give it to at the end. Many of you have read this. Samantha says, great book. Robin says, I love Brene. Brene Brown also, random fun fact, owns a pickleball team. So she's a heavy investor in one of the Austin-based pickleball teams, in case, for those of you that are pickleballers out there, I play a lot. And I was fascinated to find that out about Brene Brown. All right, so make a note in the survey and we will do that. All right, so let's talk about how your week is going. Enough about Brene Brown, enough about pickleball, enough about FreeWill. And generally things are going well. People are feeling pretty good. It's spring, we're rolling. Actually, everyone's reporting more of everything, which is sort of interesting. More happiness, more eagerness, more loneliness, and more anxiety. So all of these things are shifting up at the same time. I guess we are feeling our feelings this week. Not huge shifts, but just we'll check in on that as we go forward. And then as we're how confident we are about hitting our goals, things are really back up from 2 weeks ago. So this is really good to see. One of the higher marks we've hit all year. And if anyone has insight into why they feel like this is higher, let us know. Aline says pickleball was started in Washington State. That is correct. It's actually now the state sport of Washington State. So we'll do that. All right, so let's dive in. Let's dive in on American women in 2023. And first, what we're going to do, this is what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about some big trends shaping the lives of American women. And I recognize, by the way, that a bunch of you are from Canada, from El Salvador, from Australia, from the Philippines. A lot of these trends are true globally, but the data that we're going to walk through is on American women. We'll then talk about trends in the way they're giving, which obviously is influenced by the things happening in their life. And then we'll talk about some very specific strategies to really make the most of female philanthropy in the United States, right? So that's sort of the arc of the day. So first thing, women are increasingly marrying later in life or not at all. And this is true of men as well. The median age for a first marriage has increased 7 years in 5 decades. This is a really big deal. That 7 years is a big jump. Since 1990, there's been a 75% increase in women getting married for the first time between 40 and 59. So this is a real shift. What else is happening? As of 2021, 52% of women in the United States, this is adult women, were either unmarried or separated. So more than half. That's not been the historical norm. Approximately half of all women over 65 are unmarried. Now, most people don't think this, they don't realize this, but half of women over 65 are unmarried. This is going to play a real role in how we think about talking to older donors. We'll talk about that later. And you can see here in the graph, I mean, how big this shift was. So in 1960, 1961, the median age of first marriage is like 20. Okay. I mean, that's really young, right? You get to 1970, it's 21. By the 80s, it's 22. By 1990, it's still only 24. And then it goes up and up and up. Why 21? Why is that big jump in 21? My guess is that a bunch of people who were going to get married in 2020 pushed it back a year. And then you start to see it shift back down in 2022. But you can see this is a pretty big shift in a relatively short amount of human time. So in 2022, it's 28.2 years old. So part of folks getting married later is they're also having children later. Since 2007, which is not that long ago, the birth rate for women in their 20s has dropped by 28%. I mean, this is an enormous shift in the sort of scale of human history. The only ages where birth rates rose were for women in their 30s and in their 40s. They fell the fastest in the geographic locations with the highest job growth. So there's a sort of inverse proportion to job opportunities and how early you're having kids. The average age range for women to become mothers shifted from 25 to 29 to 30 to 34 in recent years. This is a big deal. And particularly millennial women are having children much, much later in life than baby boomers. Now, there's a couple of reasons for this, right? Part of it's job, part of it is access to really great healthcare technology that makes it safer to have children later. But on average, women are having only 1.3 biological children, and an increase are giving birth at 35 plus. So, this is not the topic for today, but also what this means is there's a real population curve happening and things are really shifting. Like birth rates really, really matter when you look 20 years down the road and you just have fewer people. And we're seeing this a lot. Some of you are in higher ed, and those of you at higher ed know what I'm talking about. You're really worried over the next few years about what we call the enrollment cliff, right? A lot of folks who were not born 18 years ago are not coming to college today. And that's really challenging for a bunch of higher ed institutions. Why is this happening? Because fertility rates have dropped, and fertility rates of the preceding generations dropped, so there are fewer parents having fewer kids. Even though women are still having children later in life, they're having fewer children overall. And I think this is one of the understated stories, right? So you look at US fertility rate in this group, 15 to 44, so really big group. How many births per 1,000 women? And look at 1909, 127 in that group. You get almost back up there during the peak of the baby boom. Now, let's take a look at this. I mean, this is really important in American history and world history. Look at how low it gets. This graph could, by the way, have a better job with more numbers on the bottom. But look at how low it gets in the 30s, right? Before that first peak in 1946, which is after American enlisted men come home from war. And you see the baby boom carry through 1964, and then it just falls off a cliff. Now, why is that? Most of it's actually the invention of modern birth control and the widespread usage of it. A lot of it's more women in the workplace, a bunch of other factors, but you can see how much that's drifting. I mean, look at how, the gap between 1909, which yes, is a long time ago in our modern history view, but is not a long time ago in human evolution. I mean, you're going down about 2.5x, right, in terms of decrease. This is a really big deal. By the way, there's no sort of sense of right or wrong in these decisions. They're obviously everybody's familial decisions, but it's sort of interesting to watch them in aggregate. Trend 2, so we're still talking about this. They are having children, but they're waiting. And some of the big factors here are higher education, labor force, financial consideration. These are all the reasons that women say when you ask them, hey, how do you decide when to have kids? Birth rate is highly, highly, highly impacted by education. The median age of a first birth for women with a master's degree is 30 compared to 24 for those with only high school or less. It's a 6-year gap, right? Based only on what kind of education you have. Now, why does this matter, especially for you? Well, your donors on average, the other thing that correlates with education is wealth. And so your bigger donors are going to be more educated. They're going to be having kids later. And we can look at this sort of in the setup, and you look at when are people having their first child? And you look at that top graph, these are women with master's degrees. Only 18% are having their first kid under 25. You look at high school or less, 62% are having their first kid under 25, right? 25 to 29 starts to even out a little bit more. And you look at 35 plus, very few high school or less educational attainment having their first kid then, but 1 in every 5 women with a master's degree has that. So, this stuff's really shifting. And as you're about to see, some of this is correlated with women just becoming more educated across the board. So what's happening here? Well, since 1979, more women have enrolled in degree programs than men. Women outnumber men in undergraduate and graduate degree programs by a lot, right? These ratios don't always give it credit, but I'm going to show you in a second. These are the graphs over time of total of all college enrollment by all college, 4-year institutions, and 2-year institutions. I mean, look at this, right? 1970 to 1980, how much they flip, right? And we're at almost 60-40 in 2-year in both of these. 60-40 is a really big deal. 55-45. It means for every 9 guys, there's 11 women in college education, right? This is a really sort of market change. And look at how dramatic that shift was in the 70s. I actually didn't do enough research to tell you exactly what happened in the 70s that changed this. I would love for anyone who lived through that period to chime in the chat. I do believe that Title IX played a really big role here in opening this up. Many of you will be stunned to learn how late some major colleges would have integrated. I think, Georgetown, where I went, I think it integrated in terms of allowing women, besides their nursing school in like the 60s. I mean, much later than many people would have thought. Other folks who, Laura says it's only 1970 at the University of Virginia, right? So many of you would have been born, some of you would have been born when UVA was still only a male school, right? I mean, many of you would have had parents who were born when certainly that wasn't true. So really, really interesting stuff here. As of 2019, right? So now these are all sort of trailing factors. More than half of the college educated workforce is in the US. So women still tend to drop out of the labor force at a higher degree than men do, but now they've surpassed half of the educated women's labor force. Women are more likely to have student loan debt than men and have higher balances. Not a total surprise when you know that more women went to college and more women attained graduate degrees. So it's about a 1.4 to 1 ratio at bachelor level. It's about 1.6 to 1 at graduate level, right? So law school, med school, English masters, English PhDs, all of these things are now weighted more female than male. All right, trend 4, with all this education, they're playing an increasingly massive role in the workforce. And this is important to know how much it's growing. So at this point, women hold 32% of top executive positions, a lot of room to grow here, right? A lot more room to get to equity. But that's a 5% jump since 2015. I mean, again, this is a pretty rapid change. Women hold a lot more board seats with 32% of S&P board seats. Again, this is a massive shift in 10 years. Should we get it up to 50? Yeah, we should, and probably beyond based on education rates. But this is a really big shift happening. And however, although women make up almost half, or in some cases more than half of the American workforce, they still only hold 42% of managerial positions. And so obviously a lot of room for growth there. When you look at this over time, you can see, we're starting to drift up in terms of women representing majority of the college-educated labor force. Now, what's going to happen? This is actually going to shift pretty dramatically, because as you get folks who went to college in the 70s and early 80s dropping out of the labor force as they retire, and folks who went to college in 2023 when the gap was even larger coming in, this is going to separate pretty quickly. And so I would be surprised if that management number wasn't well over 50% female by the end of this decade, for instance, right? So you're seeing a lot of who's coming into the labor force, who's coming out of the labor force. That does a lot of shaping here. Trend 5, women live a lot longer than men, and this is actually getting worse. So if you're a man on the call, I think collectively we need to do a little bit better job of taking care of our health. There's a lot of research around men not going to the doctors for preventative care, things like that. But life expectancy in the US is declining, but it's getting worse for men than it is for women. Life expectancy right now is 79 years compared to 73 years for men. This is a huge gap. I mean, 6 years is pretty dramatic. It's like 8%. Women basically getting 8 or 9% more life than men on average. And as men of older generations pass away, those men and women who are in heterosexual marriages, their female spouses are going to control all those assets. Now, why does this matter? Well, first, let's look at life expectancy. So I told you about this. I mean, first of all, that drop in 2021 is pretty considerable. It's a little scary. Now, this graph doesn't go to, it's sort of a little bit off scale and zoomed in here, but look at how much that dropped in 2021. That's a big deal. But also look at how large this gap is. I mean, this is really astonishing, how persistently large the gap is between life expectancy of women and men. Now, what else happens? Well, the median age at first marriage has been pretty steady, right? So we don't have amazing data looking back at 1930, 1940, but starting 1950, it's actually stayed pretty consistent. So there's like a couple year gap, 2 to 3 years pretty consistently between age of first marriage for men and for women. So what we're seeing here is, when a man marries a woman, on average, the man is a couple years older. Now, couple that with a 6-year life expectancy, and on average, we're looking at the man dying 8 years or 9 years before his wife. Again, in that sort of setup. And we talked back about more than half of women over 65 being unmarried. A lot of that's widows. This is a really serious thing. As we get into the great wealth transfer, which we'll actually talk about in 2 weeks, this is going to be a major factor. What else? So that's some of the big trends shaping women. Let's talk about some of the big trends shaping women's wealth beyond that incredible great wealth transfer that we talked about. So women's wealth is growing considerably, and I started the call with this because it's worth repeating several times. By 2030, this is according to a McKinsey study done for PNC, women will hold 2/3 of all wealth in the United States. Same is going to be true in Canada, same is true in a lot of Western Europe. Do not have great stats for those of you that are in the Philippines or El Salvador. But 2/3 of all wealth in the United States is held by women. A lot of this is that massively wealthy baby boomer population money being inherited first by the female spouse, and women are earning more and they're saving and investing more, right? So all of these things are combining to a world. In only 7 years, we're going to look up and say, wow, there is an enormous wealth gap, and it's not where we thought it would be. And so what this means for those of you that are in fundraising, which is most of the people on this call, is that we need to get really freaking good at raising money for women, because that's where the money is as you look going forward. So what's happening? Right now, it's about 40% of global wealth. So it's going to go from 40 to about 66. In the US alone, women, there's some very different estimates here, hold about 33% of all wealth. Now remember, some wealth is shared. So that's not noted here. 44% of ultra high net worth individuals are female in 2019. And what else is happening is there is a huge shift. There's a lot of these big collective efforts among women's groups, among the financial industry to get a lot more women investing, and it's working really well. So 61% of women are investing outside of their retirement account, which, get this, is a 17% increase in 5 years. I mean, that again is sort of an astounding rate that is likely to continue. And so you're seeing a lot more stock, crypto, mutual funds, bonds, wealth being developed and grown by women. They're outpacing men. Most people don't realize this in terms of first-time purchasers of crypto. So more women last year bought crypto for the first time than men bought for the first time. Now, it's still the case that more men in total own crypto than women, but this is a big shift that a lot of people aren't thinking about. 82% of women who own crypto say they're likely to get more in the future. So that's really interesting to see. Female customers at Fidelity, most of you know Fidelity, partly because they have the largest donor advised fund, but partly because they're an enormous investment firm. Female customers are growing faster than male customers. And according to a 2022 study by Fidelity, half of young women started investing in the past 6 months or plan to in the next 6 months. So there is a huge shift, taking money out of your standard savings account and putting it into different investments happening. And it's pretty exciting. That's really, really good thing across the board. Study of University of Chicago found that women make up 38% of stock traders, but based on that Fidelity study, you can tell that that number is going to go up. Twice as many young women are, quote, proud to invest with a purpose of making a difference compared to women over 36 and also compared to men. This is what you might think of as impact investing. And when we look at where's all this money going, 2/3 women are investing in individual stocks or bonds. 60% are investing in mutual funds. Half are doing money markets. 24% are doing ESG or sustainable investments, also sometimes called impact investments. 23% are investing in cryptocurrency, right? So this really matters. And now we got to think, okay, are we ready to take these kinds of gifts? If this is where women are putting their money, can we also allow them to make donations this way or not? All right, so we talked about what's happening in the world. It seems like it sparked a ton of conversation. We talked about where women are growing and putting their wealth. Let's talk about how women give. And a lot of this is from you all, right? So this is there are some really important points we're going to make here. So if you're a little distracted right now, it's a good time to tune in. When we ask you what percentage of your organization's donor base is women, 54% of you said half to 3/4. A small percentage of you said 3/4 to all of them. Less than a quarter said, 11% said less than a quarter. And then 31% said 25 to 50%. What you see here is, for almost everybody, not almost everybody, but for a decent majority, women are the majority here. Now, let's hold that in mind, right? So women are the majority of your donors. When we look at major donors, suddenly that's shifted. And only about 36% said women are a majority of our major donors. Okay. In fact, a quarter said there's 0 to 25 of the major donors. Well, now let's look at this. What percentage of your organization's stock donors identify as female? Ooh, now we're really in a bad spot. 58% said less than a quarter. 58% said less than a quarter, even though most people said more than half of your donors are female. 20% said a quarter to a half, and only about 21% said more than half. That's bad news. We're going to talk more about what to do with that in a second, but this is a really big problem to fix. Now, plan giving tends to be a little bit more even, but still look at this. Most of your plan giving donors are male. That's not a good look if you go back and look at all the wealth that women are going to inherit, right? That means there's some strategic amiss here. And so we'll talk more about that in a second. About DAF donors, again, there is a huge percentage of DAFs owned by women, and yet 58% of you said less than a quarter of my DAF donors are female. Let's see what this says. And then crypto, again, almost everybody said less than a quarter. So we're going to get into some more stuff here, but But let's just sort of name that across the sector, what are we doing? We have a ton of female donors, and somehow we're not elevating those folks to major donors. We're not elevating them to non-cash donors. And this is a real problem because especially as we get down the line, where 2/3 of all the wealth is held by women, we need to make sure that we're really allowing them to give big gifts. And so we poured over that research, which by the way came from you all, and said, oh, wow, there's some really big things to fix here, and let's dive in on some strategies to turn that around. All right, so a couple insights into how women give before we get to some very particular tactics that we're going to use. So generally, women across generations are more charitable than men. Giving increased for both genders in 2021, 84% of women and 81% of men consider it important. Women also give more gifts and a greater proportion of their money than men. This is even true among high net worth donors, right? So 93% of high net worth women give to charity compared to about 87% of men with the same amount of money. And they give more money to more causes. So women give to more causes overall. Single gifts may be slightly smaller. Millennial women support even more organizations. And 55% of millennial women say they support a wide variety of causes versus a third of baby boomer women. Now, take this with a grain of salt, but it's all self-reported. Women say they're more motivated by heart versus their head when it comes to giving. Women report being less likely than men to engage in financial strategies that could enable even greater impact. And so in a study by Fidelity Charitable, 35% of women who own stocks or bonds didn't know they could donate these assets to charity. So this is a really big deal, right? Because these are going to be the biggest gifts that you get. And if we don't know that it's possible, we're going to run into some trouble. The pandemic had a big impact on how women felt about giving, especially among millennial women. 47%, so almost half of millennial women said giving became more important. 32% of boomers said it became more important. Both of those are pretty high. But as I mentioned a moment ago, they report being less aware of tax advantage giving strategies. So more men than women know that stocks and bonds can be used to donate to charity. Only 48% of men and only 43% of women know that privately held assets like business interests can be donated. Now, again, this is all self-reported, right? So you might have the guys saying, oh yeah, I knew that. But it's worth sort of calling out generally. Women are also using the internet more often to give not just their small gifts, but their big gifts as well. So 63% of women compared to 38% of men prefer email when it comes to doing things like securing an initial meeting for major donor conversations. So that's happening more often. And 23% of women versus 36% of men prefer phone calls. Also, this is really important. We're going to come back to this in a second. Women are much more likely to watch how-to videos than men are, right? To sort of go out and actively try to learn more about a wide variety of things. So we're going to use this later on and talk it through. The other insight here, and this is really important, is that women prefer to donate collectively. So many of you know what giving circles are. They're sort of where a group gets together, pools a bunch of money, and then gives it all to one place. So you get a lot more impact because instead of me giving, it's 20 people giving, and obviously that's a lot more money. The number of giving circles has increased fivefold since 2007 to more than 2,000 in the United States. Now, 60% of these are formed around identity, things like gender or race or religion or age. But 70% of them are majority female, and nearly half of them are exclusively female. So exclusively female giving circles are the #1 most common type of giving circle. And this really hints to some different ways that women are giving. By some estimates, they've given more than 1.3 billion via giving circles. That data is a little bit old. And so maybe it's past 2 or 3 billion at this point. So why did this happen? Well, there was a linguist who I think was also at Georgetown, I might be wrong there, named Deborah Tannen. And she really talked about conversation and how men and women use conversation differently. Now, before I tell you what it said, let's note that this was a gross generalization and had some criticism around it for being such a gross generalization. So obviously, individuals are vastly different within a given group. But what she called out is that conversation for women is what she called rapport talk. Women use conversation primarily to build connection with the people they're talking to. And what men use is report talk, not rapport talk, report talk. Men use conversation primarily to build status. And you have this divide between, are we building connection or are we building status? Again, pretty gross generalization, but also a helpful framework to think about two different options in the way that we're treating our donors. So consider, right, you want to consider how your giving levels, a huge part of donations and major giving has been built around assigning status as opposed to connection. And then things that women seem to be gravitating to in philanthropy are built around connection instead of building status. Now, one of the things that's interesting, right, think about what giving circles can teach us about the desire for greater immediate impact and connection as opposed to just status. Now, one of the things we talked about a bit earlier that some folks were pretty shocked by is how late much of higher ed integrated and became co-ed. Now, what does that mean? Well, it certainly meant that there weren't a lot of women going to UVA in the 60s when they were not allowed to. What else does that mean? It meant that by 1990, the class of 1960 was still entirely male. And by the way, the folks 20, 30 years out of your school are the ones giving the big checks, right? It's not the sort of recent grads. And so what it means then is that philanthropy is built around the needs of men, because if you're UVA and you're looking back at your biggest donors, they're all dudes, because that's who was graduating in 1962 when you weren't allowing women in. And so much of this that's become sort of the de facto in modern philanthropy is built out of necessity on the needs of men. And that gives us a really big opportunity to rethink it as the wealth balance shifts pretty dramatically, obviously over the last 20 years, but in the next 20 years going forward. So really important point that I want you all to take away there. So when we think about this, right, and again, some women are totally driven by status, some men are totally driven by connection, but it's helpful to think about these sort of different drives and how we associate each. All right, so let's talk about some strategies for generating really big gifts from women. Well, first, what we see here is that women tend to be really receptive to education, especially education that connects. Many donors are really looking to you, the nonprofit staff experts, to be experts in how to give. And so they will be open to educating them on different ways to give that will make the biggest impact for the mission. And they're hungry for it. It's okay, and it's encouraged to send emails with phrases on different giving methods like, did you know? Did you know that if you're over 70 and a half, you can give directly out of your IRA and save a ton on taxes, right? Did you know you can give crypto if you're newly invested in that and you can save this way? Did you know that we have a button on our website? It's right here. And you can use it to give these smarter ways, right? And as more women invest in stocks and crypto, as you're seeing a huge shift in that direction, it's really important to raise awareness about giving this way, because this is the most tax beneficial way to give for most folks. Here's an example of an email that our team recently drafted for some folks. And it's a little tough on a wide screen to give a long email. So what I want you to know is that this infographic on the right is really couched in the middle of that email. And so the subject line is 4 ways to give smarter in 2023. In 2023, our college has ambitious plans to expand scholarships, build a new science center, grow our athletic programs, and so much more. And we're grateful for folks like you who are finding new ways to join and help. More and more, our supporters are making tax-smart gifts to support our college instead of donating cash. And so support the college this way. But in the middle of that email goes this infographic, which you can see on the right. And so now it's this really educational material to really help you figure out what works for you. Oh, you own cryptocurrency? Well, appreciated crypto can be up to 20% more valuable than donating cash. Oh, you own stocks? Save on 2 types of taxes by donating appreciated stock. Learn more about stock giving today. I have a donor advised fund. DAPs make it simple. Give a grant this way. I'm 70 and a half or older. Oh, you're eligible to make a tax-free donation from your IRA. And this sort of content that is really thoughtfully educational tends to really connect with people who are eager to learn. And also that builds connection because it shows that you're looking out for them, as opposed to just saying, wow, you're so great, we'd love to, honor you or whatever. So that's really, really cool. And a big shout out to our in-house content team for putting that together, right? It's very pretty, it's very simple. And those of you that have been to our writing sessions, right? All these best practices for writing in major giving and planned giving, know that you'll recognize that this is all mostly in 8th grade language. We're not using a ton of jargon, right? It's very simple and straightforward. So hats off to our content team that did that. When we focus on the how-to, you may also want to record short videos to major donors explaining 1 or 2 of your favorite types of giving. Now this, there are plenty of software tools out there. This can be, just like you're here now, you see me now, you can record your own Zoom calls and show, hey, look, hey, it's so great to meet you. We're so great to see you again. I just wanted to reach out and connect. And I want to share a little bit about how other donors are giving. Here's a couple of reasons on why you might give stock. And by the way, I'm going to show you on my screen how to access that tool on our website. Now, this is an important point too. Some of you feel like, oh, I can't, I don't have the video production quality or whatever. It doesn't have to be polished. And the less it's polished, the more it feels actually authentic and builds connection, right? So you're not Spielberg, and we don't expect you to be, but you can record a short video, even if it's on your phone, or it's really good to be able to just record it on Zoom and share your screen and say, hey, I just wanted to walk you through this. But your lighting's not great. Your voice is a little scratchy, no problem, right? That makes it feel like a much bigger connection. And so often people are embarrassed about showing any donors that isn't super polished. And actually, in many cases, the polish takes away from the authenticity. So just naming that as an option. So that's strategy 1. Strategy 2, we have to make sure that non-cash gifts are a digital option. So we talked about this, how women are using tech a lot more than men are. They're using these online tools. And so, but also they're trailing behind on DAFs, stock giving, et cetera. And part of that is that we're not sort of asking them in the ways that they want to give. And so we need things like your QCD giving, you're giving from a donor advised fund, you're giving stock. That needs to be on your donate page. It needs to be part of the normal way you're reaching out to these folks. If you're not doing those one-on-one videos. I was talking to a fundraising expert yesterday, and he was telling me about a relatively small organization that's getting a ton of donor advised fund gifts, a ton. And I said, well, what's their secret? Do they have major gift officers reaching out? Do they, do they do a big symposium? What do they do? Because, they don't have that many resources. And he said, oh, what they do is they include a single link in every email that says you can also give from your donor advised fund, and it links to the donor advised fund page. And they've gotten like 30 DAF gifts in the last few months just by doing that, right? They put the same sentence in every fundraising email they sent, and it's just there, and they're getting more and more of these gifts that way. So that needs to happen on your donate page. You also want to put that line in your emails. Strategy 3, as we think about really doing this well vis-a-vis women, remember that many women are giving to more places than men are. And so if you get an $80 gift from a woman and a $200 gift from a man, you might think that man has way more money than that woman. And what might be the case is that woman's actually just given $80 to a lot more places. And so just because your prospect has given small gifts in the past does not mean that she doesn't have capacity to make a lot larger gifts if you build that connection and you make that clear ask, right? And so we're focusing on other indicators like education, job titles, home ownership, asset ownership, right? And not just the previous giving amount, because I think we're often missing out on major donors who are female because they're giving to more places instead of more concentrated male giving. So I want you to keep that in mind as well. All right, strategy 4, we're thinking differently about recognition. So we talked a bit about this, but women often give socially, they team up to make bigger gifts. And one thing that has historically happened is your chair endowments, you're sponsoring a park bench, your scholarship. They're always, the Nancy and George Miller scholarship, right? Or the single person scholarship. And instead, remember that half of women are over 65 are unmarried. More than half of women across the board are unmarried. A lot of them are giving with friends. We want to invite people to endow a chair individually, as a couple, as a trio, as a group of friends, give them different options here, because not everybody has the same relationship that you might imagine you see in your other major donors. Same thing with a giving circle, right? So a giving circle is teaming up to give $100 each. Well, that starts to add up in a really big way. So if you have a giving circles in your community, think about assigning a major donor, not to the person, but to the giving circle, and say, hey, can I come share a little bit more about what we're doing at the Land Trust, what we're doing at the Boys and Girls Club? And that can be really useful as well. And then when we think about this, and I mentioned this earlier, when we think about honoring major donors, are we doing that around connection, or doing that around status, or doing that around both? Because especially for your older institutions, if you are, Harvard, or even if you are a major museum that started in 1920, or even if you started in the 1970s, you recognize that a lot of your long-term practices were built around men, because that's who either went to your school or who were giving big gifts in the 80s. And have we stopped to rethink about how does that play for everybody, right? And so it's worth an internal conversation over coffee with your team or other things like that. Strategy 5, I see a lot of direct mail. I see a lot of website images, and people tend to forget again that many women over 65 are unmarried. So when we look at our donor stories, when we look at our photos, when we talk about the people who are impacting our charity, are we only telling stories of couples? Now, some of you are doing a great job here, but some of you aren't. And so just really giving yourself a look and say, hey, are we really being representative of the people that are giving? When you send letters or emails, are we addressing them to individuals if we're not super sure they are married, right? You have more folks who are living with friends, who are living with siblings, in some cases who are taking care of their parents. And so, if I'm a 55-year-old man living with my mom because she needs in-home care, I don't really want like a Mr. and Mrs. Postcard, right? Because we're not married. And so things like that, right? Are we being extra sure on this? Think about how you can frequently include examples of older single people so that those folks feel included as well, right? This is really important. Strategy 6, we're going to emphasize planned giving. Now, we talked about this so much, but more than half of all bequest dollars on FreeWill come from women. The data shows that women are more likely to include charitable gifts in their estate plan than men. And as we mentioned earlier, they're often the first to inherit among married couples. So their will is really, really where you want to be in, right? There's something like 4 times more widows than widowers in the United States. The bequest commitments tend to be smaller on average. Part of that is that we're given to more places, but this is also going to change as more and more wealth accumulation happens over the next 5 to 6 years. So the organizations that successfully recruit female planned giving donors are going to radically outpace their peers over the next 10 years, and make sure that you are in that category. Average gift of legacy gifts we're seeing right now is $40,000. That's per organization. So it's really going up across the board. Women in their 40s, by the way, tend to be the most generous of any age group, although you obviously see a lot of gifts from older folks as well. One thing that's interesting is that women are also more likely, when they make a planned gift, to include and ask to share their information with the nonprofit. So you can build that connection over time and really help grow that into more real-time gifts. I showed you this before, but just to sort of drive it home, I mean, the gap between marriage ages and life expectancy mean that women are about to inherit a ton of money. And that's going to be a lot of philanthropy going around. Last strategy before we get to some Q&A and some other things is, when we talk about these non-cash gifts, you really want to make sure that you're messaging broadly and not overly narrowly to find the actual decision makers. So there were 1.3 million donor advised fund accounts in 2021. There are likely about 2 million by the end of this year based on growth rates. But the average account has 1.5 users on it, and often those users are not listed on the payments. Qualified charitable distributions, which many of you are seeing a ton of, are actually 80% given by men. Now, why is that? Well, the reason is that, who had the high-paying white-collar jobs in the 70s, where you now get the compound interest over 50 years, And as most of you know, you have to be 70 plus to give these gifts. So we're really looking at sort of the pay structure in the 70s and early 80s to figure out who's got the biggest IRAs now. But, for a lot of couples, these IRAs are shared, and the decision-making is shared, even though the man's name is on the IRA. And so when we only message the people who previously gave QCDs, or we only message the people who previously gave donor advised fund grants, you actually miss the sort of real decision maker in a lot of this stuff. And so it's really important to keep pushing that message broadly, especially because we saw that so many of you are falling behind when it comes to getting women to give some of these non-cash gifts. And it's really important because these gifts make your donor better off on top of you better off, right? There's a lot more tax savings associated with these. So we can't sort of leave our female donors in the dust here because it's costing them money to give us cash compared to the sort of tax savings they could have. So super, super important. When you are sending these emails, as I just mentioned, make sure they're going broadly. This is really, really key. Susan says, I spoke with a DAF donor who says, my wife chooses the organizations, I just do the paperwork. That is pretty common. Okay, so we're going to do questions in a second. I think my colleague Phoebe is going to drop that survey I talked about in the chat. Thank you so much, Phoebe. So that is the most recent link in the chat right now. Take a second and click it. Why click it? One, the CFRE credit that we talked about. Two, the ability to give to potentially receive this book by Brene, who a bunch of folks in the chat read it and they said it's an amazing book. I will concur. And three, it's super helpful to us to get your feedback on this session. So we'll just say, please do it as a personal favor to me and to Phoebe and to the whole FreeWill team. So please take 40 seconds now and fill that out. The other thing I wanted to note, which also I think is really important, is that on April 27th, which is exactly 47 hours from right now, we are going to be doing a sort of group invitation demo of what we call our Smart Giving Suite. So this is a tool that automatically lets people give from their donor advised funds on your checkout page. It gives stock gifts from your website, right? It makes qualified charitable distributions from your website. It allows you to take crypto without ever actually taking the crypto. So people can donate crypto, but all you get is cash, US dollars. And we're having a ton of people sign up for these tools and say really, really good things about them. Because what it does is it allows all these sort of non-cash gifts that we talk about is way better for your donors, way better for you. It makes that whole process really easy for your donors and really easy for you, including things like the ability to, give out of their donor advised account without ever leaving your website, which is super cool. And so we will walk through that. So I would love to see you in 2 days, and you can RSVP here as well. Otherwise, if you're ever interested in sort of learning more about the plan giving tools that our team works super hard on, the Smart Giving Suite I just talked about, just make a small note in the survey and we'll just hop on the phone with you and give you a quick overview. And you might say, hey, I'm a food bank, I'm in Wisconsin. How do other food banks use these tools? Or how do other small nonprofits in Wisconsin use these tools? And we'll say, great, here's how they're doing it, here's what they're doing. If you're a small college or a large college, we can tell you about how other colleges are using them. If you're a big national organization, we can talk about what strategies, some of those organizations have used to generate, $50 to $100 million in giving. So pretty cool stuff there. We'd love to show it off, right? So our team is really proud of the stuff we built. Those of you that are partners, we obviously learn a ton alongside you, and that's super fun. All right, so if you haven't already, please, please, please take that survey. We are now going to dive into some questions. We have just a few minutes. So before we do that, I also want to tell you that in 2 weeks, yeah. So Tuesday in 2 weeks, we're going to do a whole session on really the steps in 2023 that you want to take as we stare down what we call the Great Wealth Transfer, which is this, almost infinity amount of money, right? $70 trillion that is going to pass over the next 20 years. And I've been in a lot of conversations lately with plan giving leaders at some of the bigger or sort of most effective teams. And what they're telling me is like, hey, this is starting, right? We're seeing more plan gifts realized than we have ever before. Last year was better than the year before, and it's really sort of the dam is about to break here. And so really excited to dive in with all of you here. We have a lot of good research and a lot of really specific tactics that you can sort of copy and paste and use. So do that. Great. So Lisa, I believe that if you fill out the survey, we'll make sure to send you an invite for that. All right, so we have just a moment or two. And so maybe before I answer a couple questions, I know that a lot of people are going to have to drop off in a second. Just want to say a huge thank you, right? I mean, this is a topic that is incredibly important to learn, that can be a little challenging because a lot of the stuff that we've done historically will not work over the next 5 years unless we make some really meaningful shifts. And so it's really important to be listening, but I can imagine that it's sort of hard to say, oh yeah, you know, my college does do a good job, but wow, we really do a lot of things that we were doing in the 60s, haven't changed it a lot. And as you can imagine, that was all totally built around a very different America than we're living in today. And so, you know, as we look towards the future, we can start to see some really clear trends, which allow us to infer what are the important steps we're going to have to take right now in order to sort of, you know, thrive well beyond, you know, this year, next year, and going forward. So happy to have you here. All right. Molly. So Molly has a question. We're going to answer a couple questions quickly. It's a great question. She says, given that women are having children at an older age, does that have any negative impact? For example, in the past, at 70 years old, you were past child rearing, had more disposable income, but now at 70, you might still have kids in college and paying that expense. This is a good question. I mean, many people won't have kids in college at 70, but they might have them at you know, 60. And it is true that you'll have, you know, people have less disposable income when they have children. Now, the counterpoint there is they're also having many fewer kids. And so, you know, my mom grew up in a French-Canadian Catholic neighborhood in Rhode Island, and she was one of 7, and that was not unusual for her time. I'm one of 4. I have very few friends my age who have the same number of siblings that I do, right? 4 is a big family among the people I know. My age, I don't know any of my friends who have, you know, who are on the path to having 4 kids, with the exception of some very religious couples who tend to have larger families. And so my guess is that some of the expense of how many kids you have, you know, changes a little bit, but it's a good thing to pay attention to. There's some questions around life expectancy and whether that's broken down by race and gender as well. Yes, it is. I don't have that data in front of me, but you can pull it up relatively quickly. Angela says, do we have any info on Gen Z? And she says, source, I'm 24 and I would not consider myself a millennial. Angela, you are not a millennial. We are actually going to do a webinar in a month and a half on millennial and Gen Z giving. And so we're going to really dive deep in there as well. All right. Some really good questions. There's some questions around survey respondents. That some of that research in terms of like where women are a majority or minority of their giving types, about 150 nonprofits fill that out. So pretty sizable number. Great. All right. It's almost 1 o'clock on the East Coast. So I'm going to pause there. A lot of other good questions. But again, just a really big thank you for joining. I mean, it was really fun to have you here. Fun to see all of the thoughtfulness in the chat, a lot of the great ideas in the chat. And obviously really fun to be able to dive in and do all this research and learn a ton in the process. So would love to see you on Thursday. If you haven't filled out the survey already, please do it. Please show up. It'll be half an hour. It'll be super chill. We'll sort of share a little bit about the tools, a little bit about how other nonprofits are using them. And then in 2 weeks, we're going to do this deep dive on the Great Wealth Transfer, which is honestly maybe the most important story in philanthropy. And so wouldn't want to miss that. And feel free to bring friends or other folks at your organization.